The heavy oak doors of Meridian County's most prestigious auction house had never witnessed such a blatant display of contempt. Cornelius Vex, whose net worth exceeded the GDP of small nations, stood like a towering monument of arrogance in his $1,000 Italian suit, pointing a manicured finger at the weathered man in overalls who had just entered. "Security!" Vex's voice boomed across the marble-floored lobby, causing heads to turn and conversations to halt mid-sentence. "Remove this vagrant from the premises immediately." The man in question was Jasper Whitmore, a 73-year-old farmer, whose calloused hands told the story of 5 decades spent coaxing life from unforgiving soil. His boots, still bearing traces of morning mud, squeaked against the polished floor as he clutched a crumpled auction catalog to his chest. The contrast between his humble appearance and the opulent surroundings couldn't have been more stark. "Sir, I have every right to be here," Jasper said quietly, his voice steady despite the dozens of eyes now fixed upon him. "I'm a registered bidder." Vex's laugh was cold and mechanical. "Registered bidder? Look at yourself, old man. This is an auction for serious collectors, not a charity case looking for farm equipment. The antique tractors are sold at the county fairgrounds, not here." The crowd of wealthy patrons began to murmur, some nodding in agreement with Vex's harsh assessment. These were people accustomed to exclusivity, to spaces where wealth served as an invisible velvet rope. The auctioneer, Bartholomew Pike, shifted uncomfortably behind his podium, torn between maintaining decorum and avoiding confrontation with his most valuable client. Jasper's weathered face flushed, but his dignity remained intact. "Mr. Vex, I'm here for the same reason as everyone else. I have business to conduct." "Business?" Vex stepped closer, his presence imposing and intimidating. What possible business could a dirt farmer have at an auction featuring million-dollar artwork and rare antiquities? The insurance alone on these pieces costs more than your annual income. The security guards, 2 burly men in black suits, approached hesitantly. They'd been instructed to maintain order, but the situation felt increasingly uncomfortable. Jasper hadn't done anything wrong. He'd simply walked through the front door like any other potential bidder. "Perhaps," suggested one of the guards, diplomatically, "there's been a misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding," Vex declared with the authority of someone accustomed to having his every word obeyed. "This man doesn't belong here. Look at him. Those clothes, those hands, he's probably planning to steal something. I won't have the integrity of this establishment compromised by fortune hunters and vagrants." The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Several patrons gasped audibly, while others whispered behind jeweled hands. The social hierarchy that governed such spaces had been invoked, and everyone present understood the unspoken rules. Jasper's jaw tightened, but he maintained his composure with the quiet strength that comes from a lifetime of facing adversity. "I've never stolen anything in my life, Mr. Vex, and I have as much right to be here as anyone else." "Rights?" Vex's voice dripped with disdain. "Rights are for people who can afford them. This is a private establishment, and I'm suggesting they exercise their right to refuse service to undesirable elements." The confrontation had reached a crescendo, with the entire auction house holding its collective breath. What none of them knew was that this moment would mark the beginning of the most spectacular reversal of fortune any of them had ever witnessed. Auctioneer Bartholomew Pike found himself in an impossible position. Cornelius Vex represented nearly 30% of his annual revenue, a client whose displeasure could destroy his reputation overnight. Yet something about the elderly farmer's quiet dignity gave him pause. In 40 years of conducting auctions, Pike had developed an instinct for reading people, and Jasper Whitmore didn't fit the profile Vex was painting. "Gentlemen," Pike announced, his voice cutting through the tension, "perhaps we could resolve this privately in my office?" "There's nothing to resolve," Vex snapped. "Either this vagrant leaves or I take my business elsewhere, and I'll make sure every serious collector in the state knows about your lack of standards." The threat was delivered with the casual brutality of someone who'd wielded financial power like a weapon his entire life. Pike's face paled as he calculated the devastating impact of losing Vex's patronage. But before he could respond, Jasper spoke up. "Mr. Pike, might I show you my registration papers?" From his worn leather wallet, Jasper produced not just the standard bidder registration, but something that made Pike's eyes widen in astonishment. The document bore the official seal of Meridian County Trust, one of the most exclusive private banking institutions in the region. The account number listed had enough zeros to make even seasoned auction professionals take notice. "This is highly irregular," Pike stammered, studying the papers with growing confusion. The account represented a line of credit that exceeded 7 figures, more than enough to participate in even the most exclusive lots. Vex, sensing something shifting in the atmosphere, snatched the papers from Pike's hands. His expression transformed from smugness to bewilderment as he read the financial documentation. "This has to be forged," he declared, though his voice carried less certainty than before. "I assure you it's genuine," Jasper replied calmly. "You're welcome to call the bank to verify." The suggestion sent a ripple of whispers through the crowd. Several patrons who had been nodding along with Vex's dismissive comments now looked uncertain. The social dynamics of the room were shifting like sand dunes in a windstorm. "Even if this is real," Vex said, his voice taking on a defensive edge, "it doesn't change the fact that you don't belong here. Money doesn't buy class or breeding." "You're absolutely right," Jasper agreed, surprising everyone present. "Money certainly doesn't buy class, but it does buy the right to participate in public auctions." The subtle rebuke landed like a precision strike. Several patrons exchanged glances, some beginning to look embarrassed by their earlier assumptions. The power dynamic that had seemed so clear moments before was now murky and complicated. Pike, seizing the opportunity to diffuse the situation while protecting his business interests, made a decision that would prove prophetic. "Mr. Whitmore, your registration appears to be in perfect order. You're welcome to participate in today's auction." Vex's face flushed crimson. "This is outrageous. I won't stand for this kind of treatment. Do you have any idea who I am?" "I know exactly who you are, Mr. Vex," Pike replied with newfound confidence. "Just as I now know who Mr. Whitmore is. Shall we proceed with the auction?" The crowd began to file into the main auction hall, the earlier tension replaced by curious anticipation. What kind of farmer carried that kind of credit? What was he planning to bid on? The questions multiplied with each step toward the bidding room. Jasper followed quietly, ignoring the stares and whispers that trailed in his wake. He'd learned long ago that actions spoke louder than words, and today would be no exception. As he took a seat in the middle of the auction hall, he could feel Vex's burning gaze from across the room. What none of them could have anticipated was that the real surprise was yet to come. The auction hall buzzed with an electric tension that had nothing to do with the $1 million artwork adorning the walls. Word of the confrontation had spread through the room like wildfire, and every eye seemed to dart between Cornelius Vex, seated in his usual front-row position, and Jasper Whitmore, who had chosen a modest seat near the middle of the hall. Bartholomew, Pike took his position at the podium, his gavel gleaming under the crystal chandeliers. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to today's extraordinary auction featuring pieces from the legendary Pemberton estate." The first several lots proceeded normally. A Ming Dynasty vase sold for $200,000. A rare manuscript went for $150,000, and a collection of Civil War artifacts fetched $300,000. Vex bid aggressively on several pieces, his paddle rising with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. Each time he won, he would glance back at Jasper with a smug expression, as if proving his superiority. Then came Lot 47, a modest wooden chest that had belonged to Revolutionary War General Nathaniel Pemberton. The starting bid was set at $5,000, surprisingly low for an item with such historical significance. "This particular piece," Pike announced, "contains the general's personal correspondence and field notes from the Battle of Yorktown. Truly a unique piece of American history." Vex's paddle shot up immediately. $5,000, $10,000, came a quiet voice from the middle of the room. The hall fell silent, Jasper Whitmore had entered the bidding. Vex turned in his seat, his eyes narrowing with predatory interest. This was exactly what he'd been waiting for, the chance to humiliate the farmer publicly by outbidding him into submission. $25,000, Vex called out with theatrical flair. $30,000, Jasper responded without hesitation. A murmur rippled through the crowd. The bidding was escalating far beyond the item's estimated value. Pike's eyebrows raised as he looked between the two men who had transformed the auction into a personal battleground. $50,000, Vex declared, his voice carrying across the silent room. $75,000, Jasper replied, his tone remaining conversational. The crowd was now fully engaged, sensing they were witnessing something unprecedented. Vex's face began to redden as he realized this wouldn't be the easy victory he'd anticipated. $100,000, Vex practically shouted. Jasper leaned forward slightly in his chair. $200,000. The gasps from the audience were audible. A simple wooden chest was now commanding a price that exceeded most of the evening's major lots. But what happened next would be remembered in auction house legend for decades to come. $250,000, Vex called out, though sweat had begun to bead on his forehead. Jasper stood slowly from his seat, his weathered hands straightening his simple shirt. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly through the hushed hall. $500,000. The silence that followed was deafening. Even Pike seemed stunned by the astronomical bid. But Jasper wasn't finished. And Mr. Pike, he continued, his voice growing stronger, I should mention something about that chest. You see, General Nathaniel Pemberton was my great-great-great-grandfather. The revelation hit the room like a thunderbolt. Suddenly, everything began to make sense. The substantial line of credit, the intense interest in this particular item, the quiet dignity in the face of humiliation. Those letters and field notes, Jasper continued, contain references to land grants given to his family for their service to the Continental Army. Land that included what is now downtown Meridian City, including the property where Vex Industries has its headquarters. Cornelius Vex went white as a sheet. Every person in that room knew the implications of what they'd just heard. If those documents proved legitimate claims to the land, they could potentially invalidate decades of property ownership and development. Pike's gavel hand trembled slightly as he processed the magnitude of what was unfolding. Do I hear $550,000? The hall waited in absolute silence. Vex opened his mouth, then closed it again. For the first time in his adult life, he was speechless. Cornelius Vex sat frozen in his chair, his mind racing through the catastrophic implications of what he'd just heard. The Vex Industries Tower, his crown jewel of commercial real estate, sat on land that might legally belong to the humble farmer he'd just tried to humiliate. 30 years of development, hundreds of millions in investments, all potentially built on ground that wasn't rightfully his. Going once for $500,000, Pike called out, his voice barely steady. Vex's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. He could bid higher. His fortune certainly allowed it. But what would be the point? If Jasper truly had legal claim to the land, outbidding him for the documents would only delay the inevitable legal nightmare. Going twice for $500,000. The auction hall held its collective breath. Some of the wealthiest and most powerful people in the state sat transfixed, watching a dramatic reversal of fortune that would be talked about for generations. Sold to bidder 247, Mr. Jasper Whitmore, for $500,000. The gavel's bang echoed through the room like a gunshot. Polite applause began to ripple through the crowd, growing stronger as the reality of what they'd witnessed sank in. The farmer, who'd been dismissed as a vagrant, had just made one of the largest single purchases in the auction house's history. Jasper walked calmly to the payment desk, producing a checkbook from his overall pocket. As he wrote out the check with the same steady hand that had guided plows and milked cows for decades, whispers began to spread throughout the room. "Did you know who he was?" someone asked. "The Pemberton family." "I should have recognized the name," another whispered. Vex tried to throw out a man whose family helped found this country. The social dynamics that had been so clear at the beginning of the evening had completely inverted. Now it was Vex who looked out of place, his expensive suit and arrogant demeanor suddenly seeming vulgar and nouveau riche compared to Jasper's quiet dignity and genuine historical pedigree. But the evening's surprises weren't over. As Jasper completed his transaction, he turned to address the room. His voice, no longer quiet and defensive, carried the authority of a man who had just reclaimed his rightful place in the world. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "I want to clarify something. While it's true that General Pemberton was my ancestor, and while those land grants do exist, I have no intention of challenging current property ownership. The land was sold legally by my family over a century ago, and I respect the rights of current owners." A collective sigh of relief swept through the room, none more profound than the one that escaped Cornelius Vex's lips. But Jasper wasn't finished. "However," he continued, "I do want to share something with Mr. Vex specifically." Every head turned toward the billionaire, who looked like he wanted to disappear into his leather chair. "The reason I've been living as a simple farmer, despite having access to considerable resources, is that I believe in earning respect through character and hard work, not through the size of one's bank account. My family's trust has been quietly supporting agricultural programs, veterans services, and educational initiatives throughout this region for over 50 years. The room was completely silent, hanging on every word. I came here tonight specifically to acquire my ancestors' papers, not for legal purposes, but because they belong with family. What I didn't expect was to be judged and found wanting based solely on my appearance and occupation." Several patrons shifted uncomfortably in their seats, remembering their own reactions to Jasper's arrival. "Mr. Vex," Jasper continued, "you assume that because I work with my hands and dress simply, I must be inferior to you. You tried to have me removed from a public establishment based purely on prejudice and arrogance." The indictment was delivered with surgical precision, each word carefully chosen for maximum impact. Cornelius Vex remained seated, his face cycling through shades of red and white as the full weight of his humiliation settled upon him. The man he dismissed as a vagrant had not only outbid him spectacularly, but had revealed himself to be part of one of America's most distinguished families. The irony was suffocating. Vex, whose wealth was barely 3 generations old, had tried to exclude a direct descendant of Revolutionary War aristocracy. Jasper wasn't finished with his public address. "I'd like to share one more thing with everyone here tonight," he said, his voice carrying easily through the silent hall. "The Pemberton Family Trust, which I've had the honor of managing for the past 20 years, has been the anonymous donor behind many of this region's most significant charitable works." Pike leaned forward from behind his podium, suddenly understanding pieces of a puzzle he hadn't known existed. "The new wing at Meridian General Hospital," Jasper continued. "The scholarship program at the State University, the veteran housing, Project Downtown, all funded by our trust. We've always believed that true wealth should be measured by how much good you can do, not by how much luxury you can afford." The revelation hit the room like a second thunderbolt. Several people in the audience suddenly recognized charitable galas they'd attended, donation drives they'd participated in, all organized around funds from the man who'd been treated like an unwelcome intruder. Mrs. Cordelia Ashworth, the wife of a prominent judge, stood up from her seat. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, her voice carrying clearly, "my grandson received one of your scholarships. He's now in his 3rd year of medical school because of your family's generosity." Other voices began to join in. "The hospital saved my daughter's life in that new cardiac wing. My father lived his final years with dignity in the veteran housing. That scholarship program gave my nephew a chance he never would have had." What had begun as a night of social humiliation for Jasper was transforming into something approaching a testimonial dinner. Meanwhile, Cornelius Vex sank deeper into his chair, realizing that his attempt to exclude Jasper had backfired in the most spectacular way possible. But the evening's final act was yet to be played. Jasper raised his hand gently, quieting the growing chorus of gratitude. I appreciate your kind words, but I want to address something directly with Mr. Vex. All eyes turned to the billionaire, who looked like he was contemplating escape routes. Mr. Vex, you asked security to remove me because you believed I didn't belong here. You judged me based on my clothes, my work, and your assumptions about my worth as a human being. In doing so, you revealed something important about your own character. The words weren't delivered with anger or vindictiveness, but with the measured tone of someone rendering a fair judgment. I could respond to your behavior in kind. I could use my family's influence and resources to make your life difficult. I could hold grudges and seek revenge. But that's not who I am, and it's not what my family represents. Vex looked up, a flicker of hope crossing his features. Instead, Jasper continued, I'm going to extend an invitation. The Pemberton Trust is always looking for successful business leaders to join our board of advisors. We could use someone with your expertise in commercial development, if you're willing to use those skills to help others, rather than simply to accumulate wealth. The offer hung in the air like a bridge across a chasm. Everyone in the room understood the magnitude of the gesture. The man who had been publicly humiliated was offering redemption to his tormentor. Vex stood slowly, his legs unsteady. For the first time in decades, he was genuinely speechless. The room waited in absolute silence for his response. Cornelius Vex stood in the center of the auction hall, surrounded by the very people who had witnessed his spectacular fall from grace. The weight of genuine humility, an emotion he hadn't experienced since childhood, pressed down on his shoulders like a physical force. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Mr. Whitmore, he began, his usual commanding tone replaced by something far more human. I don't know what to say. A simple acknowledgement would be sufficient, Jasper replied gently, showing mercy where none had been offered to him. Vex took a shuddering breath. I was wrong. Completely, inexcusably wrong. I judged you based on appearances and my own arrogance. And in doing so, I revealed the worst parts of myself to everyone here tonight. The admission rippled through the crowd like a stone dropped in still water. Many of these people had never heard Cornelius Vex admit to being wrong about anything, let alone issue a public apology. I've spent so many years believing that wealth equals worth, Vex continued, his voice growing stronger with each word, that I forgot there are more important measures of a person's value. You've shown more class and dignity in the past hour than I've displayed in the past decade. Jasper nodded respectfully. We all make mistakes, Mr. Vex. What matters is what we learn from them. If your offer still stands, Vex said, straightening his shoulders, I would be honored to serve on your advisory board, and I promise you, I will use whatever skills I have to help others, not just to build my own empire. The transformation was remarkable to witness. The arrogant billionaire who had tried to have a farmer ejected had been replaced by someone who seemed genuinely humbled and eager to make amends. Jasper extended his weathered hand, and Vex shook it firmly. The gesture brought a round of spontaneous applause from the crowd, not the polite, perfunctory clapping of high society, but genuine appreciation for witnessing redemption in real time. But the evening had one final surprise in store. Bartholomew, Pike stepped forward from his podium, clearing his throat for attention. Ladies and gentlemen, I have an announcement to make. After 40 years in this business, I've never witnessed anything quite like what happened here tonight. He paused, looking directly at Jasper. Mr. Whitmore, your grace under pressure and your willingness to forgive has reminded all of us what true class looks like. As such, I'm making a decision that I hope will set a precedent for future auctions. Pike turned to address the full room. From this day forward, the Meridian Auction House will implement the Whitmore Standard. We will judge our patrons solely by their conduct and character, never by their appearance or assumed social status. Everyone who enters these doors with respect and dignity will be treated with the same in return. The announcement brought the loudest applause of the evening. Several patrons stood, and soon the entire room was on its feet, honoring both Jasper's dignity and Pike's commitment to change. As the evening wound down and patrons began to leave, many stopped to speak personally with Jasper. Former strangers shared stories of how his anonymous charitable work had touched their lives. Business cards were exchanged, not for networking purposes, but for genuine connections built on mutual respect. Cornelius Vex was among the last to leave. As he approached Jasper, he carried something unexpected, humility mixed with determination. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, "I want you to know that this evening has changed me. Not just my behavior, but my fundamental understanding of what success really means." "Good," Jasper replied with a warm smile. "That makes the $500,000 I spent tonight the best investment I've ever made." 3 months later, the Meridian Tribune would run a front-page story about the largest charitable donation in the county's history. Cornelius Vex had liquidated several luxury assets, and working through the Pemberton Family Trust, had funded the construction of a community center that would serve low-income families for generations to come. The article's headline read, "From Ivo Billionaire to Benefactor, the auction house encounter that changed everything." But perhaps the most satisfying detail was mentioned only briefly in the article's final paragraph. The community center's main hall had been named the Jasper Whitmore Center for Human Dignity, a reminder that true worth isn't measured by what's in your wallet, but by what's in your heart. As Jasper often told visitors to the center, the richest person in any room isn't the one with the most money, it's the one with the most character. And on that memorable night at the auction house, everyone learned exactly what he meant.